The assassination of President Jovenel Moïse of Haiti should raise numerous questions about just how this nation, which started out so nobly, has now become the murky, dysfunctional, poverty and disaster-riddled country where bands of foreign assassins can so brazenly walk into the innermost sanctum of the presidential residence, kill the president, and leave a potentially violent power vacuum in the country. We have all come to accept Haiti as the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, which has long been crippled by dictators and political instability. However we choose to look at it, Haiti's situation is tragic. According to Terry F. Boss, there have been 55 presidents of Haiti since 1804, when the country gained its independence. Out of these, 3 were assassinated or executed, 7 died in office, 1 actually committed suicide, and 23 were overthrown by the military or paramilitary groups. 2 of them, Henri Namphy and Jean-Bertrand Aristide, were overthrown twice. Only 9 presidents completed full terms. 31 held office for 2 years or less. In 1946 and again in 1988, a military junta ruled without a president. Nearly all presidents were either military officers or were closely affiliated with the military. Throughout Haiti's history, many presidents have attempted to become rulers for life. Every president has exploited Haiti's impoverished people and its resources for political gain or personal aggrandizement or both. There have been very few months in the history of this beautiful country when it went without a revolt, uprising, riots, political murders, or mass killings. During the 20th century, the United States compelled 5 presidents to leave office. So this history gives us some context to why the international donor community today classify Haiti as a fragile state. Because by definition, a state earns this classification when the government cannot or will not deliver basic core services to its people, especially its poor. Haiti has been further characterized as a country in search of nationhood, or a country held hostage by the state. In almost every aspect of development, Haiti has variously been characterized as a nightmare, predator, collapsed, failing parasitic, kleptocratic, phantom, virtual or pariah state. So, are we to accept that this remarkable country, which sets such an incredible example for all oppressed people by insisting on freeing itself from the shackles of slavery and colonization, must continue to exist as the world's weeping child? Just how did Haiti get to the state that it is in today? Welcome to the Sankofa Pan-African series. Please subscribe and turn on your notification buttons if you haven't done so. Also, please support us by pledging a token amount to this channel through Patreon, so we can continue to bring you videos like this one. No amount you pledge is too small. Thank you. So let's start by taking a brief look at the history of the incredible country known as Haiti. Haiti forms part of the island of Hispaniola. Before the European mercenary Christopher Columbus arrived there on the 6th of December 1492, the island was populated by people called Arawaks. Although the Spanish claimed ownership of the whole island, they initially settled mainly in the east of the island of Hispaniola. Now, the west was left largely empty, and in the 17th century, the French settled there. In 1697, the Spanish and French signed the Treaty of Ryswick, which left France the western third of the island, which they then called Saint-Domingue. Now, in the 18th century, Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti, became rich and was the wealthiest colony in the French Empire, and perhaps even the richest colony in the world at the time. Before the Haitian Revolution, Saint-Domingue produced roughly 40% of the sugar and 60% of the coffee that was imported into Europe. All of these prosperity, of course, was built on the blood and sweat of people who had been brought from Africa to work on European-owned plantations. The colonial economy of Saint-Domingue was based almost entirely on the production of plantation crops for exports. Now, enslaved African workers grew sugar in the northern plains and coffee in the mountainous interior. In order to sustain the plantation system, French owners imported almost 800,000 Africans to the colony. By the end of the 18th century, there were only about 30,000 French people and about 27,000 people of mixed races, whilst the rest of the population was made up of people who had actually been born and brought or sold as Africans into slavery there. So the slave system in Saint-Domingue was regarded as one of the harshest in the Americas. It had a high level of both mortality and violence. So starting around 1789, free people of color in Saint-Domingue, like Toussaint Louverture, were inspired by the French Revolution to demand freedom and equality for all, which is, after all, what the French Revolution was demanding. But by the end of 1791, the French were forced to abolish slavery on Saint-Domingue. Well, since Spain, Britain, and other European countries which owned slave colonies had not yet abolished slavery, Toussaint actually believed that the French revolutionaries in France would help uphold the freedom of Saint-Domingue and help it to develop. He was, however, disappointed. Luckily, he led a rebellion which defeated the French. But as soon as the British saw that the French had been defeated in Saint-Domingue, they went all out to overtake the colony. Britain actually invested millions of pounds by sending soldiers to try and capture Saint-Domingue in 1793. By 1801, Toussaint Louverture and others fighting for liberation had managed to end slavery on the island. And he, Toussaint Louverture, was a governor of the entire island, made up of French Saint-Domingue and Spanish Santo Domingo. For the first time anywhere in the Northern Hemisphere, Toussaint created an atmosphere in which black people, people of mixed races, and white people coexisted as equals. Please take the time to watch our episode on Toussaint Louverture to get more details about how Napoleon and also the British were defeated by the African slaves in Saint-Domingue. Now, Haitian independence was finally attained in 1804 after the French army under Napoleon was once again defeated by the black people in the colony. Their success in defeating Napoleon Bonaparte proved to enslaved people all over the world that they could rise against oppression, fight for their freedom, and win. I mean, the example that Haiti served was unique and is something that we must, people all over the world who are undergoing or have undergone one form of oppression or another, we must never forget. We must always acknowledge the role that Haiti played, as an example for all oppressed people. Significantly, even before the attainment of Haitian independence, Haitians actually fought on the side of America in America's bid to attain independence from Britain. Although this is a fact that is often neglected in American history. As a matter of fact, the independent United States, when the United States became independent, they did not support Haiti, in its own bid for independence. However, before his death, Frederick Douglass, the great African American orator and abolitionist, who had spent a 2-year stint as America's minister, resident, and consul in Haiti, acknowledged the role that Haitians played in American history in a speech that he delivered at the World's Fair in Chicago in 1893. He wanted it to be on record. And I quote, "We should not forget that the freedom you and I enjoy today is largely due to the brave stand taken by the black sons of Haiti 90 years ago. Striking for their freedom, they struck for the freedom of every black man in the world." End of quote. One of the most notable aspects of Haitian history is that the nation is the only one to have emerged as the result of a successful slave rebellion. We must never forget that. It, however, seems that Haiti has never been forgiven for standing up against slavery, colonization, and oppression. Instead, this country, whose brave citizens served as a beacon of hope for all oppressed people, has been left stunted by one crisis after another. First, rather than support the fledgling Republic of Haiti, the slave-owning United States opted to isolate and ignore it. The US government refused to formally recognize Haiti as a sovereign, independent nation until 1862. Even more devastating is the fact that France did not only refuse to recognize Haitian independence until 1825, but it also used what has been described as gunboat diplomacy to force the island nation to pay a crippling indemnity for the white colonizers' loss of property. The racist implication of this extortion by France can be best appreciated when we compare it with the Louisiana Purchase, which the US made from France. Now, the US paid France only $15 million for the purchase of the territory of Louisiana in 1803. Now, this worked out at about $18 per square mile. The same US, which should have been Haiti's natural trading partner, ally, and political protector, refused for over half a century to recognize Haiti's existence. Instead, responding to domestic pressure from the southern part of the US, Thomas Jefferson, who was president at the time, initiated an embargo of US trade against Haiti, which lasted until 1810. His successors also exempted the country from the 1823 Monroe Doctrine, thereby turning a blind eye to France's bullying of its former colony. The US, in fact, only formally recognized the Haitian government in 1862 because of the American Civil War. So all of this allowed France to insist on extorting the ruinous price of 50 million francs, about 20 billion in today's money, before recognizing Haiti's independence. Britain's attitude towards Haiti was also governed by its relations with France and its concern for its own Caribbean holdings. Fearing Haitian incursion on its Dominican Republic, Spain too was actively hostile towards Haiti. As such, the economic ruin that has led Haiti to its present condition is a direct result of all of these, forms of economic bullying that the country suffered at the hands of all these European countries and America. All of these economic hostility ensured that during its first decades, the new Haitian state existed with no international political and economic ties. So the economy of the country was run aground. All that prosperity that the country had in terms of sugar and coffee being exported, all of it came to a halt. So that in its first decades, the new Haitian state existed with no international political or economic ties. Its economy was decimated by years of its independence struggle and all these other economic stranglehold. So its formerly rich plantation-based trade was completely destroyed and replaced by subsistence agriculture. So sugar and coffee production moved off to Jamaica and other British colonies and Brazil. Thus isolated, Haiti was forced during the 19th century to defend itself by building fortifications and investing in a huge military establishment. This establishment propped up the remnants of the former black and mixed race elite that traditionally controlled the ports and export trade. So, as the weaponization of poverty has done in other African and Caribbean countries, it has resulted into a power structure that skimmed off the little wealth that was available in the country. This was further compounded by the 1915 U.S. invasion, which lasted 20 years and which also exacerbated the rifts within Haitian society. In essence, Haiti has not stood a chance at surviving since the end of this U.S. occupation, and the country has remained mired in poverty and has been subjected to bad and authoritarian governments. The indemnity which France insisted on collecting from Haiti, with the support of other European countries and the US, I must say, is a debt that Haiti kept paying well into the 20th century, and which many experts believe permanently enfeebled the country's development. That debt and the resulting drain on the Haitian treasury are directly responsible not only for the underfunding of education in Haiti, but also for the lack of healthcare and the country's inability to develop its public infrastructure. As I said earlier, the United States invaded Haiti in 1915 and did not leave until 1934. An occupation which, when you look at it, rivals the current American presence in Afghanistan, when you look at the length and brutality of it. The excuse for America's invasion of Haiti at the time was that the US was trying to stabilize a political crisis that followed the assassination of the Haitian president, of one of the Haitian presidents at the time. However, what the US did was to consolidate Haiti's finances according to US banking interests, while ruthlessly suppressing local uprisings in an age of hemispheric imperialism that many Americans have now chosen to forget. The American influence supported 3 decades of dictatorships under the murderous, kleptomaniac, kleptocratic Duvalier dynasty. And the excuse for America supporting the Duvalier dynasty was that the Duvalier were anti-communist. And so it didn't matter what else they did. America kept supporting them, even as they kept stealing and unleashing violence on their own citizens. America was solidly behind the Duvaliers. Most disturbing is the fact that Haiti demonstrates how 20th century foreign aid and development assistance can cripple nations, including a mess of failed projects that followed the cataclysmic 2010 earthquake, which devastated the country and then killed hundreds of thousands of people. The amount, the aid that was all pumped into Haiti only ended up further compounding the situation of the country rather than improving the lives of the people. Yeah, unsurprisingly, in 2010, Bill Clinton, felt compelled to publicly apologize to Haitians for having forced the country in the 1990s to drop tariffs on U.S. agricultural imports, a move that devastated Haiti's rice cultivating farmers. Clinton admitted, and I quote, "It may have been good for some of my farmers in Arkansas, but it has not worked. I have to live every day with the consequences of the lost capacity to produce a rice crop in Haiti to feed those people because of what I did." End of quote. While this apology is a grand gesture by former President Bill Clinton, it is not nearly enough. Currently, hunger is only one of the Haitian public's concern. The assassination of Haiti's embattled president in his home by a group of gunmen is the culmination of months of steadily escalating political instability and gang violence. In a country in which poverty has been weaponized by global powers in collusion with the Haitian elite against the majority of citizens, the future remains dire. When all these are appraised in the face of coronavirus outbreak, in a country with weak health infrastructure and no access to coronavirus vaccines, the question should be, how much more blood does the rest of the world want to demand from this country? How much blood do we want this embattled country to continue to shed before we, as a world, say enough is enough? Thanks for watching. Please give us a thumbs up and share our videos with your contacts. Also, please support us by pledging a token amount through Patreon so that we can continue bringing you topics like this one. Remember, history forgotten will most likely repeat itself. Thank you.